The floodwaters rose mercilessly, swallowing everything in their path. Trees were uprooted, fences torn down, and the once peaceful farmland was now a raging torrent. In the middle of this chaos, a tiny baby quarter horse stood trembling on a small patch of land, its hooves sinking into the wet ground. Its soft cries were barely audible over the roaring water. It had no way out, and everyone watching feared the worst. Then, one man stepped forward, ready to risk everything. The farmland had always been a place of peace, where the sun rose gently over rolling hills and the scent of fresh hay lingered in the air. Families would gather here, children playing near the barns, while the horses roamed freely across the open fields. The air was filled with the soft nickers of the quarter horses, their coats glistening under the warm sun. It was the kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where life was simple and calm. But that morning, everything changed. The storm arrived without warning. Dark clouds rolled in, swallowing the blue sky. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of the farmhouse and sending the animals into a frenzy. The first drops of rain were harmless enough, pattering against the roof like a gentle melody. But within minutes, the rain turned into a deluge, pouring in sheets and drenching everything in sight. The peaceful farmland was quickly transformed into a scene of chaos. Streams that once trickled gently through the fields became unrecognizable, raging rivers that cut through the land with violent force. Fences were torn from the ground, hay bales were swept away, and the dirt paths turned into muddy, impassable trails. The floodwaters surged higher and higher, swallowing everything in their path. It was as if the land itself was being consumed by the storm. In the midst of the chaos, the quarter horse herd reacted instinctively. The older, stronger horses led the charge toward the higher ground, their powerful legs splashing through the rising water. They whinnied loudly, calling out to each other as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The foals followed as best as they could, their smaller legs struggling to keep up with the adults. The scene was both frantic and heartbreaking, as the horses fought to escape the relentless floodwaters. But not all of them made it to safety. One tiny foal, barely a few months old, found itself separated from the herd. The water had risen too quickly, and the little one, too small and weak to fight the current, was stranded on a shrinking island of mud and grass. Its coat, once shiny and soft, was now soaked and matted with mud. The foal cried out, its high-pitched whinnies a desperate plea for help. But the herd was too far away, and the floodwaters were too strong. From a distance, the people who lived on the farm watched helplessly. The family that owned the horses stood on the edge of the rising water, their hearts sinking as they saw the little foal struggling. They had done everything they could to save the animals, but the storm had moved too fast, and now it was too dangerous to reach the stranded baby. The current was too strong, and the risk was too great. All they could do was pray that the water would recede before it was too late. But the water showed no signs of slowing down. It continued to rise, inch by inch, as the storm raged on. The foal's cries grew weaker, its tiny legs trembling as it struggled to stay upright on the slippery patch of mud. Time was running out, and everyone watching knew it. Something had to be done, but no one dared to take the risk. The scene was heart-wrenching, a stark reminder of how unforgiving nature could be. And then, amidst the despair, a man stepped forward. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, just a neighbor who had grown up around horses and understood their value, not just as animals but as living, breathing souls. He looked at the foal, then at the raging water, and made a decision that would change everything. Without hesitation, he began to prepare for the impossible. The man, known to the locals as Jack, was an unassuming figure. He had lived on the neighboring farm for years, often helping out with the quarter horses whenever needed. Jack's connection to the animals ran deep, he'd grown up around them, learning to respect their strength and gentle spirit. As he stared at the stranded foal, memories of his own childhood flooded back, times when he had watched his father rescue animals in need, no matter the risk. Jack knew the odds were against him. The water was cold and fast, carrying debris that could injure or kill. The ground beneath his feet was already slick with mud, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. But he couldn't stand by and do nothing. That tiny foal was fighting for its life, and Jack felt a responsibility to give it a chance, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He turned to the family standing nearby, their faces pale with fear and worry. "I'm going to try to get to it," Jack said firmly. The farmer shook his head, his voice trembling. "It's too dangerous. You'll get swept away." "Maybe," Jack replied, "but I have to try. If we don't, it doesn't stand a chance." Without waiting for further argument, Jack grabbed a length of sturdy rope from the barn and tied it securely around his waist. He handed the other end to the farmer, instructing him to hold on tight. "If I slip, pull me back," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his mind. He took a deep breath, his boots sinking into the mud as he stepped closer to the water's edge. The onlookers held their breath as Jack waded into the icy floodwaters. The current was stronger than he had anticipated, pushing against him with relentless force. Every step was a battle, the water tugging at his legs and threatening to knock him off balance. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the little foal ahead of him. Its cries were weaker now, its tiny body trembling with exhaustion. Jack's heart ached as he inched closer. The foal's wide eyes locked onto his, a mix of fear and desperation shining through. "It's okay," Jack murmured, his voice soft and soothing despite the chaos around him. "I'm coming. Just hold on a little longer." The wind whipped around him, carrying sheets of rain that stung his face. His hands were numb from the cold, but he pushed forward, his determination unwavering. Each step felt like an eternity, the distance between him and the foal shrinking slowly but surely. The onlookers watched in silence, their eyes fixed on Jack as he battled the elements to reach the stranded animal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack reached the tiny island of mud where the foal was trapped. He crouched down slowly, careful not to startle it. The foal flinched at first, its instincts telling it to flee, but it had nowhere to go. Jack spoke softly, his voice a steady reassurance. "You're okay now. I've got you." Jack crouched near the foal, his hand brushing its wet, muddy coat. The little one trembled under his touch, too weak to resist and too scared to trust him entirely. The water surrounding them surged angrily, pulling at the fragile patch of mud they stood on. Jack glanced back toward the shore. It seemed farther away now, the rushing current widening the gap every second. The storm wasn't letting up. The sky was a deep, angry gray, and lightning flashed in the distance, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The wind roared, carrying stinging rain that made it nearly impossible to see clearly. Jack tightened his grip on the rope around his waist. He knew that every passing second pushed them closer to disaster. The foal let out a faint cry, barely audible over the chaos. Jack's heart clenched. The animal was struggling to stand, its legs wobbling like twigs under the pressure of its own weight. Each attempt to find balance made the mud beneath them shift dangerously, sending ripples across the water. Jack could feel the ground giving way beneath his boots. There wasn't much time left. On the shore, the family watched with growing dread. The farmer clutched the rope tightly, his knuckles white from the strain. His wife stood beside him, her hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Their teenage son had tears streaming down his face, though he tried to hide it by wiping his eyes on his rain-soaked sleeve. "Come on, Jack," the farmer muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "You can do this." The water rose higher, licking at Jack's knees now. He couldn't stay here long. The mud island was disappearing bit by bit, dissolving into the torrent. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back while he still could, but his eyes kept returning to the foal. Its breaths were shallow, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. If he left now, it wouldn't survive. Jack tightened his jaw. He wasn't going to let that happen. The wind picked up again, stronger this time. It howled like a wild beast, bending the trees on the riverbanks until they creaked and groaned. One of the larger branches snapped off and crashed into the water, sending up a spray that drenched Jack and the foal. The sudden noise startled the animal, and it stumbled backward, almost slipping into the flood. Jack lunged forward, grabbing its small body to steady it. His hands shook from the effort, but he held on. "Easy, easy," Jack whispered, his voice calm despite the fear pounding in his chest. "I've got you. You're not going anywhere." The ground beneath him shifted again, sinking slightly. Jack knew he couldn't wait any longer. He had to find a way to move the foal to safety, and he had to do it now. The rope around his waist felt heavier, tugging against him as if the flood itself was trying to pull him under. He gritted his teeth and glanced at the shore once more. The distance looked impossibly far, but he had no other choice. Jack took a deep breath, his mind racing for a plan. The foal trembled against him, its small body pressed close to his for warmth and security. The icy water now reached his thighs, and every step he took caused the mud beneath him to shift dangerously. He couldn't afford a single mistake, not with the foal's life hanging by a thread. Behind him, the family shouted words of encouragement, though their voices were faint against the roar of the storm. The farmer tightened his grip on the rope, anchoring himself to the ground as if his life depended on it. The teenager's eyes were wide with fear, his voice cracking as he yelled, "Don't let go, Jack. Please don't let go." Jack didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. His focus was on the task ahead, getting the foal to safety. He looked at the animal's fragile legs, now caked with mud and trembling under the strain of standing in the rushing water. It was exhausted, its head drooping low, eyes half closed. Jack gently placed his hand on its neck, his touch meant to calm it. "Stay with me, little one," he murmured. "We're getting out of here." The wind screamed again, sending another tree branch tumbling into the water just a few feet away. The splash startled the foal, and it jerked its head up, its tiny body shaking uncontrollably. Jack steadied it, whispering soothing words, though his own heart was pounding. He knew the next few minutes could make or break everything. The water was rising faster now, creeping up past his thighs and threatening to swallow the last bits of solid ground beneath them. Jack felt his boots sink deeper into the mud with every movement, the suction pulling at him as if the earth itself wanted to trap him there. The foal's cries were becoming weaker, its energy fading fast. Time was slipping away. Jack glanced at the rope tied around his waist, silently thanking the farmer for holding on so tightly. He tugged on it slightly, testing its strength. The farmer's response was immediate, a firm, reassuring pull that let Jack know he wasn't alone in this fight. But the distance between Jack and the shore felt impossible to bridge. The current was growing stronger by the second, and the weight of the foal added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible task. A sudden surge of water hit Jack, nearly knocking him off balance. He staggered, his grip on the foal tightening instinctively. The animal let out a frightened squeal, its legs flailing briefly before it collapsed against Jack's chest. He could feel its rapid heartbeat, a reminder of just how fragile this little creature was. Jack planted his feet firmly, refusing to give in to the current. He couldn't fail now, not when they'd come this far. The onlookers on the shore grew more desperate. The farmer's wife clasped her hands tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. The teenager stepped closer to the edge, as if he wanted to jump in and help but knew he'd only make things worse. "Come on, Jack," the farmer shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're almost there." But Jack wasn't almost there. The shore still felt miles away, and the rising water made every step feel like a battle against nature itself. He looked down at the foal, its eyes meeting his for a brief moment. In that gaze, he saw trust, fragile, unspoken trust. The foal was depending on him, and that realization gave Jack the strength to take another step forward. The water was now at his waist, the current relentless. Jack tightened his grip on the foal, adjusting its weight in his arms. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he ignored the pain. He had to keep moving. The ground beneath him was slippery and uneven, every step a gamble. The foal's tiny breaths were faint against his chest, a constant reminder of what was at stake. The storm showed no mercy. The rain pelted Jack's face like needles, blurring his vision as he pushed forward inch by inch. The water was now at his chest, cold and relentless, threatening to drag him under with every step. He clutched the foal tightly against him, its small body shivering uncontrollably. The foal's breathing was shallow, its soft cries now reduced to faint whimpers. Jack could feel its strength fading, and the thought of losing it was unbearable. Behind him, the shore seemed impossibly far. The farmer and his family watched in tense silence, their faces pale with fear. The rope connecting Jack to the shore stretched taut, creaking under the pressure of the current. The farmer planted his feet firmly in the muddy ground, holding on with everything he had. "Hold tight, Jack," he yelled, though his voice was almost drowned out by the howling wind. His wife stood beside him, tears streaming down her face, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Jack didn't respond. Every ounce of his focus was on the next step, the next movement that would bring him closer to safety. The mud beneath his boots was treacherous, sucking at his feet and threatening to pull him under. He stumbled, his heart lurching as the foal slipped slightly in his arms. The little one let out a pitiful squeal, its hooves flailing weakly. Jack tightened his grip, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "I've got you," he whispered. "I'm not letting go." A sudden rush of water surged around him, nearly knocking him off his feet. Jack staggered, his knees buckling as he fought to stay upright. The current was stronger now, as if the storm itself was determined to claim him and the foal. He glanced toward the shore, his vision blurred by rain and exhaustion. The farmer's son was waving frantically, shouting something Jack couldn't make out. All he could hear was the roar of the river and the pounding of his own heart. Another obstacle loomed ahead, a large tree branch, torn loose by the flood, spinning wildly in the current. It was coming straight toward them. Jack's pulse quickened as he calculated his next move. If the branch hit him, it could knock him off balance, or worse, injure the foal. He braced himself, shifting the foal slightly to shield it from the impact. The branch crashed into him with a force that sent pain shooting through his side. He grunted, his boots sliding on the muddy ground, but he held firm. The foal let out a frightened cry, and Jack murmured softly to calm it. "It's okay. I'm okay. We're okay." But he wasn't okay. His body was exhausted, his muscles burning from the strain of fighting the current and carrying the foal. His soaked clothes clung to him like dead weight, and the cold water sapped his energy with every passing second. The shore felt farther away than ever, an unreachable sanctuary taunting him from the distance. The wind screamed again, bending the trees on the riverbank until they creaked and groaned. Another wave of water surged around Jack, this one carrying debris, branches, chunks of wood, and pieces of fence swept away by the flood. He ducked his head, shielding the foal as best as he could. The rope around his waist tugged sharply, a reminder that the farmer was still holding on, still fighting alongside him. The foal's small head rested against Jack's chest, its eyes half closed. It was so still now, its energy almost completely drained. Jack's throat tightened as he realized how close they were to losing this fragile life. "Not yet," he muttered through gritted teeth. "Not like this." He took another step, and then another, each one harder than the last. The ground beneath him was no longer solid, it was a slippery, shifting mess of mud and water that offered no stability. His boots sank deep with every movement, the suction threatening to trap him. He pulled against the rope, signaling to the farmer that he was still moving, still fighting. The response was immediate, a firm tug that felt like a lifeline in the chaos. The foal let out another weak cry, its voice barely audible. Jack looked down at it, his heart breaking at the sight of its fragile form. The little one was fighting so hard to survive, despite the odds stacked against it. Jack's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let this foal die here, not if he could help it. He forced his legs to move, each step a battle against the elements. The storm raged on, the water rising higher, the current growing stronger. But Jack refused to give up. The foal's life depended on him, and he would do whatever it took to get them both to safety. Jack's body screamed in protest as he pressed forward. His legs felt like lead, each step a monumental effort against the relentless current. The water was now chest-high, icy and unforgiving, surging with a strength that seemed almost alive. The foal in his arms was barely moving, its small body limp against his chest. He could feel its faint breaths, shallow and uneven, and he knew its time was running out. The storm intensified, lightning splitting the sky and illuminating the chaos around him. For a brief moment, Jack caught a glimpse of the shore. The farmer stood braced, holding the rope with every ounce of his strength. His son was beside him, tears streaming down his face as he shouted encouragements that were swallowed by the roar of the river. The farmer's wife had dropped to her knees, clutching her hands together as if willing Jack to succeed through sheer force of prayer. Just a little further, Jack muttered, though the shore seemed impossibly far away. His voice trembled, not from fear but from sheer exhaustion. Every muscle in his body burned, his arms aching under the weight of the foal. The cold had seeped into his bones, and his soaked clothes dragged him down like an anchor. He tightened his grip on the rope around his waist, silently thanking the farmer for holding firm. Another surge of water hit him, stronger than the last, and Jack stumbled. His boots slid on the unstable mud beneath him, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might fall. The foal let out a weak cry as Jack struggled to regain his footing, his heart pounding in his chest. "Hold on," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Just hold on." The current wasn't just water anymore, it was filled with debris from the storm. Broken branches, uprooted shrubs, and pieces of fencing hurtled past him, some brushing against his legs and threatening to knock him off balance. Jack's eyes darted around, scanning for the next threat. His grip on the foal was firm, but he knew that one wrong move could send them both under. A massive piece of driftwood slammed into his side, knocking the wind out of him. Jack gasped, his knees buckling under the force of the impact. He sank briefly into the water, the icy current rushing over his shoulders. The foal squealed, its legs flailing weakly as Jack fought to stay upright. His fingers dug into the mud, his boots scraping against the slippery ground as he pushed himself back up. The rope around his waist tightened, the farmer's desperate pull anchoring him just enough to regain his balance. The shore seemed farther away than ever. Jack's vision blurred, rain mixing with sweat and exhaustion clouding his mind. Every step forward felt like an impossible task, the weight of the foal and the force of the current combining to drag him down. But he refused to stop. The foal's life depended on him, and Jack wasn't about to give up. "Come on, Jack," the farmer's voice cut through the storm, strong and unwavering. "You're almost there." Jack wasn't sure if that was true, but the words gave him a flicker of hope. He glanced down at the foal, its wide eyes meeting his for a brief moment. The trust in that gaze, fragile yet undeniable, gave Jack the strength to take another step. And then another. The mud beneath him shifted again, and Jack realized with a sinking feeling that the ground was disappearing. The water was rising faster than he had anticipated, and the small patches of stability were vanishing one by one. He tightened his grip on the foal, adjusting its weight in his arms. "Just a little more," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the foal or himself. A sudden roar drew his attention upstream. Jack's heart dropped as he saw a wave of debris-laden water rushing toward them. It wasn't just the current anymore, this was a surge, powerful and unforgiving, capable of sweeping away anything in its path. There was no time to think, no time to plan. Jack planted his feet as firmly as he could, bracing himself for the impact. The wave hit with brutal force, nearly knocking Jack off his feet. The rope around his waist dug into his skin as the farmer pulled with everything he had, keeping Jack anchored. The foal cried out, its small body pressed tightly against Jack's chest. The water surged around them, cold and unrelenting, but Jack held firm. His arms ached, his legs trembled, but he refused to let go. The wave passed, leaving Jack gasping for breath. The shore was still impossibly far, but he could see the faint outlines of the farmer and his family, their desperate faces blurred by rain and distance. He wasn't alone. They were counting on him. The foal was counting on him. And that was enough to keep him moving. Jack's body was beyond exhaustion, every muscle burning, his lungs heaving with each labored breath. The shore felt like a distant dream, but the faint silhouettes of the farmer and his family anchored him. The rope tugging at his waist was his lifeline, a constant reminder that there were people counting on him, cheering for him. But the water was now up to his shoulders, the current stronger than ever, and his footing was slipping away. The foal in his arms was barely moving. Its once trembling body now felt limp, its shallow breaths growing weaker. Jack's heart clenched as he looked down at the fragile creature. He could see the fight draining from its eyes, and the thought of failing it was unbearable. "Stay with me," Jack whispered, his voice cracking. "We're almost there." Another wave surged around him, pushing him backward and nearly pulling the foal from his grasp. Jack tightened his arms around the little horse, his fingers numb from the cold. The rain was relentless, pounding against his face and blurring his vision. His boots scraped against the unstable ground, searching desperately for something solid. But the mud beneath him had turned into a swirling, shifting trap, and every step felt like a gamble. On the shore, the farmer shouted something, his voice barely audible over the storm. Jack couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. The desperation in the man's tone was clear. They were all running out of time. The rope around Jack's waist tightened suddenly, pulling him forward a few inches. He turned his head, catching a glimpse of the farmer bracing himself against the pull, his hands gripping the rope with fierce determination. The sight gave Jack a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. They were in it together. "Come on, Jack," the teenager yelled, his voice breaking with emotion. "You can do it." Jack gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of strength he had left. His legs felt like lead, his arms screaming in protest from carrying the foal. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, and his soaked clothes clung to him like dead weight. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the foal's life was hanging by a thread. He took another step, then another, the water swirling around him with violent force. The shore seemed closer now, though the distance still felt insurmountable. Jack focused on the little victories, each step forward, each inch closer to safety. The foal let out a faint whimper, its head resting against his chest. It was still fighting, still holding on, and that gave Jack the strength to keep going. A large piece of debris hurtled past him, splashing water into his face and momentarily blinding him. Jack staggered, his footing slipping, but he didn't fall. The rope tugged at his waist again, steadying him. He wiped the water from his eyes, his focus locked on the shore. He could see the farmer and his son now, their figures more distinct. They were so close, yet the last stretch felt like an eternity. The ground beneath him shifted again, and Jack realized he was stepping into deeper water. The current pulled at him with unrelenting force, threatening to sweep him and the foal away. Panic surged in his chest, but he forced it down. He couldn't afford to lose focus. He adjusted his grip on the foal, holding it higher to keep its head above the water. "Almost there," he murmured, though his voice was barely audible even to himself. Finally, his boots found something solid, a patch of ground that didn't sink beneath him. Jack pushed forward, his movement slow but deliberate. The shore was just a few feet away now, and he could see the farmer reaching out, his hands outstretched to grab the rope. The teenager was beside him, ready to help pull Jack to safety. With one last surge of effort, Jack stumbled toward the shore. The farmer and his son grabbed the rope, hauling him in as the current tried to drag him back. Jack collapsed onto the muddy bank, the foal still cradled in his arms. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his entire body trembling from exhaustion and relief. The family rushed to his side, their faces a mix of tears and gratitude. The farmer knelt beside Jack, his hands gently resting on the foal's trembling body. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved it." Jack looked down at the foal, its wide eyes meeting his. The little horse let out a soft, pitiful whimper, but it was alive. Against all odds, it had survived. Jack felt a wave of emotion wash over him, relief, pride, and a deep, unshakable connection to the tiny creature he had fought so hard to save. The storm raged on, but in that moment, everything else faded away. Jack had done the impossible. He had given the foal a second chance, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone watching of the extraordinary power of courage and compassion. The rain lashed against the windows of the farmhouse as Jack stood silently near the edge of the flooded field. The foal's cries carried faintly through the storm, each sound tugging at his heart. He could see the poor creature, barely a speck in the distance, stranded on what was left of an island of mud. The water had risen so quickly, cutting off every path to safety. Jack clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he took in the scene. Behind him, the farmer paced anxiously, his boots sloshing through the muddy ground. His wife stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale as she stared helplessly at the raging waters. Their teenage son had climbed onto a fence post, his eyes wide with fear and frustration. "We can't just leave it there," the boy shouted over the roar of the wind. "It's going to die." The farmer shook his head, his voice heavy with regret. "It's too dangerous. The current's too strong. I won't risk losing someone for this." Jack remained silent, his gaze fixed on the foal. It was trembling, its legs barely able to hold its small body upright. He could see the exhaustion in its every movement, the fight slowly draining from it. The thought of leaving the animal to die, alone and scared, was unbearable. "Jack, don't even think about it," the farmer said suddenly, as if reading his mind. "It's not worth it. You'll never make it out there." But Jack wasn't listening. His mind was racing, weighing the risks against the slim chance of success. He thought about the years he'd spent around horses, the connection he'd always felt to them. They weren't just animals to him, they were living, breathing souls, capable of trust, fear, and love. And this foal, so young and innocent, didn't deserve to be lost to the storm. He turned to the farmer, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to try." The farmer's eyes widened in disbelief. "Jack, no. You'll get yourself killed. Look at that water, it's a death trap." "I know the risks," Jack replied, his tone steady. "But I can't just stand here and do nothing. That foal has no one else. If I don't try, it doesn't stand a chance." The farmer's wife stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Jack. Think about your family. Think about yourself. What if you don't make it back?" Jack hesitated for a moment, their words sinking in. He wasn't a reckless man by nature. He understood the danger, the very real possibility that this could end badly. But when he looked at the foal, struggling to stay upright as the water rose around it, he knew he couldn't walk away. The thought of living with the knowledge that he had let it die was something he couldn't bear. "I've made up my mind," he said quietly. "I'm going." The farmer sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. "If you're going to do this, at least take some precautions." He gestured toward the barn. "There's rope in there. Tie it around your waist, and I'll hold on to the other end. If something goes wrong, I'll do my best to pull you back." Jack nodded, grateful for the offer of help. He headed toward the barn, the wind whipping at his soaked clothes. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of hay and damp wood. He found a sturdy length of rope and quickly tied it around his waist, making sure the knot was secure. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. As he stepped back outside, the farmer took hold of the other end of the rope, wrapping it tightly around his arm. "I'll keep it as steady as I can," he said. "But if it gets too dangerous, don't be a hero. Turn back." Jack gave him a small nod, though he knew in his heart that turning back wasn't an option. He glanced at the teenager, who was staring at him with a mix of awe and worry. "You're brave, Mr. Jack," the boy said quietly. "I'd help if I could." Jack managed a faint smile. "You're helping plenty just by being here. Keep your dad steady, all right?" The boy nodded, gripping his father's arm as if adding his own strength to the effort. Jack turned back toward the water, taking a deep breath. The wind howled around him, the rain slashing against his face, but his focus was unshaken. He took his first step into the floodwaters, the icy current immediately tugging at his legs. The farmer's wife let out a soft sob, covering her mouth with her hands as she watched him wade deeper into the water. Jack could feel the rope tightening around his waist, a lifeline tethering him to the shore. Each step was a struggle, the mud beneath his boots threatening to pull him down. The water surged around him, cold and unrelenting, but he kept his eyes locked on the foal. The little horse let out a faint cry as Jack drew closer, its ears twitching at the sound of his voice. "Easy now," Jack murmured, his tone calm and reassuring. "I'm coming for you." Behind him, the farmer and his son held the rope with all their strength, their knuckles white as they braced against the current. The teenager shouted encouragements, his voice carrying just enough to reach Jack. "You're doing great. Just keep going." The foal stumbled, its legs giving out as the mud beneath it shifted. Jack's heart clenched as he watched it struggle to stand, its fragile body trembling from exhaustion. He quickened his pace, his determination overriding the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind. "Almost there," he muttered to himself. "Just a little more." The closer he got, the more the current seemed to fight him. It pushed against his chest, threatening to sweep him away, but Jack refused to stop. The foal was within reach now, its wide, frightened eyes locking onto his. Jack extended a hand slowly, not wanting to startle it. "It's okay," he said softly. "I've got you." Jack reached out slowly, his hand trembling not from fear but from the sheer intensity of the moment. The foal's wide, terrified eyes darted between him and the raging water around them. It stumbled weakly, its tiny hooves slipping on the unstable mud beneath it. "Easy now," Jack murmured, his voice low and calming. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help." The foal flinched slightly as his fingers brushed its soaked coat. Its body was icy cold, trembling from exhaustion and fear. Jack crouched lower, trying to make himself appear less threatening. He could feel the water pulling at him, the current tugging his legs and threatening to topple him, but his focus was locked on the foal. "You're okay," he whispered, inching closer. "I've got you." Behind him, the rope around his waist tightened as the farmer and his son steadied it from the shore. Jack felt the tension in the line, a lifeline anchoring him to safety, though it felt miles away. The storm roared around him, the wind howling like a wild beast, and the rain lashed against his face. He could hear faint shouts from the shore, but the words were lost in the chaos. The foal let out a pitiful whimper as Jack finally wrapped his arms around its small body. It was lighter than he'd expected, its frailty evident in the way it leaned heavily against him. Jack could feel its rapid heartbeat, a fluttering rhythm that spoke of both terror and sheer will to survive. "You're so brave," he said softly, adjusting his grip to support its trembling legs. "We're getting out of here." But the moment he tried to lift the foal, the ground beneath him shifted. The mud, loosened by the relentless current, gave way, and Jack's boots slipped. He stumbled, his heart leaping into his throat as he struggled to regain his balance. The foal cried out, its legs flailing weakly, and Jack tightened his hold, refusing to let go. "It's okay," he panted, his voice steady despite the panic clawing at his chest. "I've got you." He managed to plant his feet again, though the mud sucked at his boots with every movement. The water was higher now, swirling around his waist and threatening to climb even further. Jack glanced back toward the shore, his vision blurred by rain. The farmer was still there, gripping the rope with all his strength, his son beside him, yelling encouragements. Their figures were faint and distant, but they were there, and that was enough to keep Jack moving. The foal let out another weak cry as Jack shifted its weight in his arms. It wasn't just fear in its voice, it was exhaustion, the kind that came from fighting a losing battle for far too long. Jack's chest tightened as he looked into its wide, glassy eyes. "You're safe now," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm not letting anything happen to you." Step by agonizing step, Jack began to move toward the shore. Every movement was a battle, the current pushing against him with relentless force. The water was ice-cold, seeping through his soaked clothes and chilling him to the bone. His arms ached from holding the foal, and his legs burned with the effort of keeping his balance on the slippery, unstable ground. But Jack refused to stop. The foal's life depended on him, and failure wasn't an option. Suddenly, a large branch, torn loose by the storm, came hurtling toward them. Jack saw it out of the corner of his eye, but there was no time to react. It crashed into his side, the impact knocking the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward. He gritted his teeth, tightening his grip on the foal as the current tried to pull them both under. "No," he shouted, planting his feet firmly and forcing himself upright. "We're not giving up." The foal whimpered, its small body trembling violently in his arms. Jack could feel its fear, its desperation, and it only strengthened his resolve. He adjusted his grip, holding it closer to his chest, and took another step forward. The shore was still far away, but it was closer than it had been a few minutes ago. Progress was slow, but it was progress nonetheless. The rope around his waist jerked suddenly, a sharp reminder of the support he had behind him. Jack glanced back, his vision swimming with rain and exhaustion. The farmer was waving his arm, signaling something, but Jack couldn't make out the words. He could only assume it was another warning to hurry, to keep moving before the storm swallowed them whole. The mud beneath him shifted again, and Jack nearly lost his footing. The water was at his chest now, the current growing stronger with every passing second. He gritted his teeth, forcing his legs to move. "Just a little more," he muttered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "We're almost there." The foal stirred weakly in his arms, its head resting against his shoulder. Its breaths were shallow, its body limp, but it was still alive. Jack took comfort in that small fact, letting it fuel his determination. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, each one a struggle against the biting cold that wrapped around him like a vice. The shore was so close now he could see the farmer's face, his features twisted in determination as he anchored the rope tightly. The boy beside him waved frantically, yelling words of encouragement that barely reached Jack's ears over the deafening roar of the storm. But the distance, just a few dozen feet, felt like an eternity. The foal stirred in Jack's arms, letting out a faint cry that tugged at his heart. Its small, fragile body was limp now, and Jack could feel its heartbeat growing weaker against his chest. "Not now," he muttered through gritted teeth, adjusting his grip to cradle the foal's head higher above the water. "We're almost there. Stay with me." The current surged again, nearly knocking him off balance. Jack dug his boots into the muddy ground, but there was hardly any solid footing left. The storm had turned the field into a chaotic swirl of debris and rising water. A log, half submerged and spinning wildly, rushed toward him. He shifted the foal to one arm and raised the other to deflect it, the impact jolting through his entire body. He staggered, his feet slipping, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he might fall. The rope tightened abruptly, jerking him upright. The farmer had seen him falter and pulled with all his strength to keep Jack steady. Jack nodded in silent gratitude, though he wasn't sure the man could see him. Every step forward now felt like a monumental effort, his legs screaming in protest as the cold sapped the last of his energy. His arms, numb and trembling, tightened instinctively around the foal. The shore was no more than 20 feet away now, but the water was at its deepest point. It swirled around Jack's chest, threatening to pull him under. His soaked clothes clung to him like dead weight, and his boots felt as if they were filled with lead. He forced himself to focus, each step deliberate, his eyes locked on the outstretched hands of the farmer and his son. "Come on, Jack," the farmer bellowed, his voice cutting through the storm. "Just a little further." The foal let out another weak whimper, and Jack glanced down. Its eyes, wide and glassy, met his for a fleeting moment. There was trust in that gaze, a fragile, unspoken connection that gave Jack the strength to keep moving. He couldn't let it down. He wouldn't. Then, disaster struck. The rope around Jack's waist slackened suddenly, and he felt the loss of tension like a punch to the gut. The farmer stumbled, losing his grip for a split second as the slick mud beneath him gave way. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as the current surged, dragging him sideways. The foal cried out, its small legs flailing weakly, and Jack tightened his hold, refusing to let go. "Hold on," the boy screamed, scrambling to help his father regain control of the rope. Together, they pulled with every ounce of strength they had, the tension snapping back as the rope went taut once more. Jack's body jolted forward, and he used the momentum to take another step, then another. The shore was so close now he could see the tears streaming down the farmer's face, could hear the raw emotion in the boy's voice as he yelled, "You've got this. Don't stop." Jack's boots found a patch of solid ground, and he planted his feet firmly, pushing against the current with all his might. The water was lower here, just below his chest, and for the first time in what felt like hours, he felt a sliver of hope. "Almost there," he whispered, though his voice was hoarse and barely audible. "Just a little more." The foal stirred again, its body trembling in his arms. Jack adjusted his grip, cradling it closer to shield it from the wind and rain. Each step now was a victory, each inch closer to safety a triumph over the relentless storm. He could feel the strength returning to the rope around his waist, the farmer and his son pulling steadily to guide him home. Finally, Jack reached the edge of the floodwaters, where the muddy ground gave way to the solid bank. The farmer rushed forward, his hands outstretched to grab the rope and steady Jack as he climbed the last few steps. The boy was right behind him, his eyes wide with relief and awe as he took in the sight of the soaked, trembling foal cradled in Jack's arms. "You did it," the farmer said, his voice choked with emotion. He reached out to help Jack, his grip firm and steady. "You got it." Jack collapsed onto the muddy bank, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The foal let out a faint cry, its head resting against Jack's shoulder. It was alive. Against all odds, it had survived. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, the weight of the ordeal crashing down on him. He'd done it. He'd saved the foal. The farmer's wife rushed forward, a blanket in her hands. She draped it over the foal, her tears mingling with the rain as she gently stroked its soaked coat. "You're safe now, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're safe." The boy knelt beside Jack, his face full of admiration. "You're amazing, Mr. Jack," he said quietly. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." Jack managed a faint smile, though his body felt like it had been through a war. "It wasn't just me," he said, glancing at the farmer and his son. "We did this together." The storm still raged on, but the moment felt peaceful, almost surreal. The foal, now wrapped in the blanket, let out a soft, contented sigh. It was safe. They were all safe. And for the first time that day, Jack allowed himself to feel the full weight of relief. The farmer extended a hand, helping Jack to his feet. "You saved its life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Jack shook his head, his eyes on the foal. "No thanks needed," he replied. "Just make sure it gets the care it needs. That's all I want." As they stood there, drenched and exhausted but victorious, the storm began to ease. The rain softened, the wind quieted, and a faint glimmer of light broke through the clouds. It was as if the world itself was acknowledging their triumph, offering a moment of peace after the chaos. Jack glanced back at the foal, now nestled safely in the farmer's arms. Its wide eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was something unspoken between them, a bond forged in the storm, unbreakable and enduring. He smiled, knowing that this little life, so fragile and full of promise, had been worth every step, every struggle, and every ounce of pain. The storm was beginning to calm, though its effects were still visible all around. The once peaceful farmland was a scene of devastation, floodwaters pooling in every low-lying area, debris strewn across the fields, and the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth. Yet, amidst the chaos, there was a moment of stillness and relief on the muddy riverbank. Jack sat slumped against a fallen log, his body trembling from exhaustion. His soaked clothes clung to him, and his muscles ached with every movement, but his eyes never left the foal. The little horse, now wrapped snugly in a dry blanket, lay curled on the ground nearby. Its chest rose and fell in slow, steady breaths, a comforting rhythm that brought tears to Jack's eyes. Against all odds, it had survived. The farmer knelt beside the foal, his large hands gently brushing over its damp coat. His face, lined with worry just minutes earlier, was now soft with gratitude. "I can't believe it," he murmured, shaking his head. "You actually did it, Jack. You saved it." Jack didn't respond right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the words sink in. The weight of what he had just accomplished was overwhelming. Every step through the raging flood, every moment he thought he might not make it, it had all been worth it for this. Finally, he looked up at the farmer and managed a faint smile. "I couldn't let it die," he said simply. "It didn't deserve that." The farmer's wife was kneeling on the other side of the foal, her hands trembling as she stroked its head. Her tears mixed with the rain still dripping from her hair, but her smile was radiant. "It's a miracle," she said softly. "I thought for sure we'd lost it. But you didn't give up." Jack shrugged, though the motion sent a fresh wave of pain through his shoulders. "It wasn't just me," he said. "You held that rope. If it wasn't for you and your son, I wouldn't have made it back." The boy, standing nearby, straightened at the mention. His face lit up with pride, though his voice was still filled with awe. "You were incredible, Mr. Jack. I've never seen anything like that. You didn't even hesitate." Jack chuckled weakly, shaking his head. "Oh, I hesitated, all right. But sometimes, you've got to stop thinking and just act." The farmer extended a hand, helping Jack to his feet. Jack groaned as he stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. The farmer placed a firm hand on his shoulder, his grip warm and reassuring. "You've got a heart bigger than anyone I've ever met," he said. "We won't forget this. Ever." Jack nodded, his gaze returning to the foal. "What matters is that it's alive. That's all I wanted." A faint sound broke through the quiet, the soft, distant nicker of a horse. The farmer turned toward the sound, his face lighting up with recognition. "The herd," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "They're coming back." Jack followed his gaze and saw them, several adult quarter horses emerging from the trees on a nearby hill, their coats glistening in the faint light breaking through the clouds. At the front was the foal's mother, her ears pricked forward and her movements urgent as she descended the slope. The foal lifted its head at the sound, its ears twitching. It let out a faint, trembling whinny, a cry that was weak but full of longing. The mother horse answered with a louder nicker, quickening her pace as she approached. Jack stepped back, giving them space as the mare trotted onto the muddy bank. Her eyes were wide with concern as she lowered her head to nuzzle the foal, her breath warm and soft against its damp coat. The foal responded immediately, struggling to its feet with wobbly legs. It stumbled, nearly falling, but the mare was there to steady it, her body a protective barrier against the world. The two stood together, their bond unmistakable, and Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. It was a reunion that spoke of resilience, love, and the unbreakable ties of family. The farmer's wife wiped her tears with the edge of her sleeve, her smile radiant. "Look at them," she whispered. "It's like the storm never touched them." Jack nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "That's how it should be," he said. "They deserve a chance to keep going." As word of the rescue spread, neighbors began to arrive, trudging through the muddy fields to offer their help and see the foal. One by one, they gathered on the riverbank, their faces a mix of awe and admiration as they listened to the farmer recount the story. They offered blankets, food, and even dry clothes for Jack, though he waved most of it off with a tired smile. "You're a hero, Jack," one man said, clapping him on the back. "I don't know anyone else who would have done what you did." Jack shook his head. "I'm no hero," he said. "I just did what needed to be done." Another neighbor, a woman holding a thermos of hot coffee, smiled warmly. "That's what makes you a hero," she said. "You acted when no one else could." The boy, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly spoke up. "He didn't just save the foal," he said, his voice firm. "He showed us all what it means to care. To really care." The crowd murmured their agreement, and Jack felt a wave of humility wash over him. He didn't see himself as the brave figure they were painting him to be. He was just a man who couldn't stand by and let an innocent life be lost. But their words warmed him nonetheless, a reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing could inspire others to do the same. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the waterlogged fields, the crowd began to disperse. The foal, now walking steadily beside its mother, followed the herd as they made their way back to higher ground. Jack watched them go, a small smile playing on his lips. They were safe now, and that was all that mattered. The farmer approached him, his face serious but kind. "You should get some rest," he said. "You've been through hell today." Jack nodded, though he lingered a moment longer, his eyes on the horizon. The storm had taken so much, fields destroyed, fences torn apart, but it had also reminded him of something important. Courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting in the face of fear, about doing what was right even when the odds were stacked against you. As he turned to leave, the farmer's wife called out to him. "Jack," she said, her voice warm. "You saved more than a foal today. You reminded all of us what it means to have hope." Jack paused, her words settling over him like a blanket. Then he smiled, tipping his hat. "Sometimes, hope's all we've got," he said simply. And with that, he walked away, his steps heavy with exhaustion but his heart lighter than it had been in years. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape scarred by its fury. Fields that once stretched endlessly with lush, green pastures were now waterlogged, their muddy trails winding through debris left in the storm's wake. Broken fences, uprooted trees, and scattered belongings spoke of the chaos that had unfolded. But amidst the destruction, there was also a quiet resilience, a reminder that even in the face of nature's wrath, life could endure. Jack sat on the porch of his modest home, a cup of coffee cradled in his hands. His body ached, every muscle sore from the ordeal, but the pain was nothing compared to the peace he felt knowing the foal was safe. He could still see its wide, trusting eyes as it nestled against its mother, their bond as unbreakable as the love he had seen on the faces of the farmer and his family. As the golden light of dawn stretched across the horizon, Jack let his mind wander back to the moments that had tested him so deeply. He had always considered himself an ordinary man, someone who did his best to help when he could. But the storm had challenged every part of him, his courage, his determination, and his belief in his own limits. It had pushed him to make a choice that could have cost him everything. And yet, he would do it all over again. Bravery, Jack realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about feeling the fear, acknowledging the risks, and stepping forward anyway. When he had seen the foal stranded in the rising waters, fear had gripped him, fear of failure, fear of the storm, fear of losing his own life. But he couldn't let that fear paralyze him. The sight of that fragile, innocent creature fighting for its life had been stronger than his hesitation. It had reminded him that sometimes, bravery meant making the impossible choice simply because it was the right one. In the days following the storm, Jack had been approached by neighbors and strangers alike, all of them calling him a hero. They praised his courage, his determination, and his willingness to risk his life for the foal. But Jack had struggled to accept their words. To him, what he had done wasn't extraordinary, it was necessary. The foal's life mattered, just as every life did. And in that moment, he had been the only one who could act. "Hero," he had said to one neighbor, shaking his head with a faint smile. "Heroes are the ones who save the world. I just saved a foal." But deep down, he knew that bravery didn't have to be grand or world-changing. It could be quiet, humble, and deeply personal. It could be the act of one man stepping into a storm to save a single life. And in that sense, perhaps bravery was something everyone was capable of. The bond Jack had felt with the foal during those tense moments in the floodwaters was something he couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just a connection to the animal, it was a connection to life itself. The foal's wide, frightened eyes had reflected a vulnerability that reminded Jack of his own humanity. Its desperate cries had been a call not just for help, but for hope, for kindness, for someone to care enough to act. Compassion, Jack realized, was what had driven him into the water that day. It was the same force that had kept the farmer and his son holding onto the rope, refusing to let go even when the current threatened to overpower them. It was the same emotion that had brought the farmer's wife to her knees, praying for a miracle when all seemed lost. Compassion was what made people stand together in the face of adversity, what turned strangers into allies and fear into action. In saving the foal, Jack hadn't just been moved by its plight. He had been reminded of the importance of compassion in a world that often felt indifferent. That single act, born out of empathy and a refusal to give up, had brought the community together in a way that nothing else could have. And for Jack, that was worth more than any praise or recognition. Sitting on the porch, Jack's thoughts turned to the foal and its mother. He had visited the farmer's property a few times since the storm, always keeping a quiet distance as the herd grazed in the recovering fields. The foal, now stronger and more confident, followed its mother closely, its tiny legs moving with a newfound steadiness. Watching it thrive brought a warmth to Jack's heart that no words could capture. The storm had taken so much from the community, homes, crops, and a sense of security, but it hadn't taken their hope. In fact, Jack believed it had strengthened it. The foal's survival had become a symbol for everyone, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, life could endure. It had shown them that resilience wasn't just about rebuilding, it was about holding on to the belief that things could get better. Jack thought of the farmer's son, who had watched the rescue with wide-eyed wonder. The boy had called him a hero, but Jack suspected that the real hero would be the boy himself one day. He had seen the spark of determination in the young man's eyes, the kind of resolve that could inspire others. If the rescue had planted even a seed of that kind of hope in the boy's heart, then every struggle Jack had faced in the flood had been worth it. The story of the rescue spread far beyond their small town. Jack had heard whispers of it being shared on the news, neighbors calling it a miracle, a testament to human courage and kindness. Strangers stopped him on the street, thanking him for what he had done. But Jack always responded the same way, with humility, a nod, and a simple, anyone would have done the same. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have stepped into the water that day. Not everyone would have faced the fear and the danger head-on. And that, he realized, was the real lesson he wanted people to take away. Courage, compassion, and hope weren't just abstract ideas, they were choices. Choices that anyone could make, if they were willing to take the risk. The foal's survival was proof of what those choices could achieve. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives in ways that couldn't be measured. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Jack finished his coffee and stood. His body still ached, a lingering reminder of the storm's fury, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. The storm had tested him, pushed him to his limits, but it had also reminded him of what truly mattered: life, love, and the simple, unshakable belief in doing what was right. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. In the distance, the herd of quarter horses grazed peacefully, the foal darting playfully around its mother. Jack smiled, tipping his hat toward them before turning toward the fields that needed tending. The storm was over, but the work wasn't done. And that was just fine with him. Because sometimes, the hardest storms left behind the clearest skies. And in those skies, hope could shine brighter than ever.